This is going to be a quick video on how to do some simple fiberglassing. So for fiberglassing, you can get the resin itself. It's just liquid resin, a separate hardener, and then you're going to need some fiberglass fabric. You can buy them separately or in kits. It's much more economical, obviously, to buy at least a gallon of resin and cloth separately in a larger quantity. This is a 4-ounce cloth that doesn't offer as much strength as the thicker, let's say, 6-ounce cloth. I think you can get it as fine as 2 ounces and as thick as 10 ounces maybe, but you can figure that out yourself. So I have two slightly different uses. These 3 wooden parts are for a boat. This is a 1/2-inch thick piece of plywood. The plywoods on the original boat were high quality marine plywood, but they still rotted. It took 40 years, but they still rotted. This is a cover to a live well. It's not for a seat. So it had 3/4-inch plywood originally. I used this 1/2-inch just to save weight, kind of a overkill on thinking it through, but anyway, once I add the fiberglass to both surfaces, I've already used this one with the top side fiberglassed. It'll be as strong as this 3/4 or close to it. So because this is a thin piece and I want to add strength, I'm going to use the 6-ounce fiberglass cloth, which is what I use on the top. This piece here is for the same size base, but it actually gets a seat mounted to it. So yeah, there's some pretty big guys that might be out fishing on this boat. Who knows, 300-pounders. So I stuck with the 3/4-inch plywood. And this is more than strong enough to hold a 300-pound person. It'll be evenly distributed on the base, which is almost this big. So I'm going to use the thinner cloth on this one, the 4-ounce, because essentially I just want to waterproof it. It mostly gets covered by a seat, but the edges will get wet. So I'm going to use the thin cloth because my focus is on waterproofing, not on adding strength. So a couple of things about the fiberglass. The nice thing is it's basically a plastic resin. It soaks into the wood, so it seals the wood. The fiberglass cloth adds tensile strength. In other words, resistance to stretching. The resin itself is strong in compression, resistance to crushing. So the two acting together gives you strength and to resist a tensile stretch or to resist a compression. The same way steel reinforced concrete would. Separately, the two don't work so well together, for instance, for a bridge, but together you can put long spans because the steel resists the stretch and the concrete resists the compression. If you made a 20-foot span in concrete, it would crumble, and if you made a 20-foot span in lightweight steel, put a car on it, it would bounce too much, but together they work fine. So it's the same general idea. Now, something to keep in mind about the fiberglass as you put it on, what we're going to do is these wooden pieces have been cut, obviously, and then I sanded them, because keep in mind, a lot of plywood products come with some kind of wax sprayed on the top. Not all of them, but a lot of the exterior construction grades do. So I sanded it clean. Plus, sitting around in the lumber yard or in my garage, it gets dust on it. So you think of the resin like paint. Whatever the resin contacts is what it's going to stick to. If you painted a dirty piece of wood, the paint might peel off with the dirt stuck behind the paint film, but not to the wood. So same idea. You want to make sure it's clean. Of course, it's got to be dry. And the easiest way to get this plywood clean is to belt sand the top layer until it gets nice and bright. So anyway, that being said, the next thing we wanted to think about is going over square edges. Now all these edges are rounded off. I rounded them off with a router. And partially for appearance sake, but also so this fiberglass cloth can roll over the edge. You'll see as I apply the resin, this rolled edge, the fiberglass still wants to spring up with the resin on it. It probably won't fold down flat at the bottom. It'll fold down here, stick up a little bit on the bottom. So I just go ahead and do the top surface with the sides, and then after it sets, which it sets pretty quickly within 20 minutes, I'll sand whatever fibers are sticking out here, and then I do the bottom with one sheet and make sure I get enough resin to bond the edge. So technically, not having the cloth continuous around the edge, you will lose strength. But how much strength do I need on the edge? The bending and compression happens on the top and bottom surfaces with this kind of an application, so I'm not concerned about it. Plus, again, the original boat didn't have fiberglass. It's an aluminum boat with a wooden floor and wooden covers, and it lasted 40 years. The thing for me is I don't want to have to cover the boat. I cover the boat so that dirt doesn't get in it, so I don't have to keep cleaning it, but I don't want to have to cover the boat. That's kind of the beauty of a utility aluminum boat. It's very low maintenance, and you don't have to mess around with it. When you add wooden parts, then all of a sudden you have to be concerned about moisture. So that's why we're doing this. Now, just to give you an idea about how the square edges will play out, let's look at this square edge. If I try to see how that cloth does not, it really doesn't want to, it doesn't really bend. It's got a kind of a spring to it because it's a crisscross pattern. It's a woven cloth. You'll see it. When I start putting resin on there, it'll just pop right up. So for the top surface of this one, I'm not planning on folding the sides at all. If it folds down as I'm adding the resin, fine, because I am using a thinner cloth on this one. Maybe I'll have better luck with getting it to conform. But if it doesn't, I don't really care. It would be nice if it did, but it's not going to be critical in this application. Okay, so the other thing that I like to do is I like to get multiple surfaces ready, because here's the thing with the resin. I'm used to doing smaller jobs like boat transoms and things of that nature, things of that size, maybe 5 feet wide by 2 feet tall. So a lot of times I use 9 ounces of resin, and in the winter time in my garage, which is semi-heated, just draws heat from the house, I get about maybe 10 to 15 minutes working time. I just did when I did this piece of fiberglass here for this panel, I did it in my garage, and it's in August, and it's set up in less than 5 minutes. So I lost half of my batch. Not a big deal. I just stop using it and throw it away, but it's a waste. This is about $35 maybe for a gallon at your local Walmart store, and everybody sells it, but I think Walmart has about the best price for a place where you can go to a store and pick it up as opposed to ordering it. So you want to mix as much as you can work with. So I'm doing this indoors tonight only because it's a bit hot outside and I don't want to lose my material. It would be nice to work with 9 ounces for each of them, so I would normally mix 18 if I knew I would have the work time, and probably work with maybe 18 or 36 ounces here. But again, I'm going to play it safe. I'm going to use 9 ounce batches. I'm ready to keep mixing. And the reason why I have so many laid out is because when you're at your last batch, it's nice to be able to use it up after you finish the surface of, for instance, when I finish this surface, I'll move to that one and that one. If you're only doing one piece, depending on how many coats of resin you want to put on, I mean, typically I'm doing at least 2 because I have top and bottom, and I get the sides done while I do the tops. Sometimes I put 2 coats on if I'm looking for a real flat finish, but if I have multiple pieces that I can just move to and lay the leftovers on, it's just more economical. So a word about what this is going to look like when we're done. The best way that I found, and again, I'm a novice, I do this as a hobby, I'm not a professional. I started doing this, I don't know, 30 years ago. I've only done maybe, I don't know, 8 projects over the span of 30 years. But if you put the cloth down first and then pour the resin on it, you seem to get a flatter surface. If that resin stays as liquidy, as thin, let's say, flowable, is when you first mix it, you'll get a nice flat surface. As soon as it starts gelling up a bit and you have to brush it on, you're going to end up with a lumpy surface. So when you see these light spots, that's where the high points were. After I finished this, and again, this was the piece that started setting up before I was ready for it to set up. After it cured, again, only about 20 minutes, I belt sanded it and took off the high spots. So I'm going to, I should put another coat on here just to get it flattened out. But structurally and for weatherproofing, you only need 1 coat of resin. If you're looking for a nice flat surface that you could, it's not going to be perfectly flat using my methods. But if you get enough thickness to it, you can go ahead and belt sand it nice and flat. I was able to do that on a boat transom I just finished. I put at least 3 coats of resin on it. So here's the thing about the thickness. We talked about it penetrating the wood, which it does, but it also adds thickness. Using a 6-ounce fabric and doing a kind of a, not looking to build it up, but just getting that fabric soaked in a nice even layer of resin on the top, I think you can expect to add a 1/16 of an inch with 2 coats of fiberglass. So if you think about it, if you start off with a 3/4 inch piece of plywood and you sand it clean, and maybe sand a little bit of high grain out of the wood, which is what I did on this piece, you might lose a 1/16 of an inch, and then you're going to add a 1/16 of an inch with 2 coats of fiberglass. So the way I look at it is, if I start with a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, I pretty much expect to end up with a 3/4 inch finished product. So the first thing we're going to do is lay out all our fiberglass on our work pieces. So I already cut this piece. This is a piece I bought in I think it was like a 5-yard by 3-foot blanket. And here's the thing about that. If you buy these kits that are essentially, they're basically intended for doing auto repairs. So they give you a piece of fiberglass that's only about 24 inches by 3 feet, I think. Something of that nature. I have a package here somewhere. So you end up having to splice multiple sheets together to do a piece this big, or a boat transom. Here's the piece that came. It comes 25 inches by 46, so 4 by 2 essentially. So think about the kinds of things you do that simply isn't going to allow you to do it with 1 sheet. So there's nothing wrong with splicing it together. I think as long as you overlap, you could see the edges get frayed. I use a razor blade to cut this, but the edge here is frayed. So I overlap the frayed edges, and I think it meshes pretty well. And in fact, I use smaller pieces for the sides that don't show. So here's the thing: when you lay those pieces, the cloths, multiple pieces of cloth together, and you let them mesh, you get a little bit of a ridge there. So you end up having the side sand that off if you're looking for a nice smooth finish, or you can leave it. So I use my smaller pieces on the back sides, like the back sides of those lids. Who cares? The back side of this deck, you won't even be able to see it. It's not a deck that lifts up. It's fixed in place and has a cubby hole that's hard to get in. It's a small area. So I'm going to use the scraps on the back sides of everything. But on the top side, I want to do as little work as possible. So here's something to look at. You can cut this stuff with a scissor, with a good scissor. But your typical household scissor won't cut it so well in both directions. So What I do is I use a razor knife, and I normally just cut it right on the work. I'll end up with a little bit of slice marks in this wood, but once the resin soaks into it, especially together with the cloth, you're not even going to see it. Plus the resin going to fill that little cut mark. It's not going to hurt anything. So I already marked it out with a Sharpie marker, and I'm just going to cut it quite simply and get that piece off of it. I don't like to have a lot of extra cloth. I mean, you could cut it off later, but it tends to pull the resin off your work and just make a bigger mess. And it eats up the resin. It just soaks up some resin that isn't going to do you any good by having it soaked up. So again, I just keep it pretty close to what I need. So this one's going to lay on like this. Now, this isn't dimensionally stable in its before the resin's applied. So if you look at this, you can pull it and distort it. So when I mark my lines, by the time it's ready to cut, a lot of times that line ends up curved because the whole sheet's distorted. So I just cut on the line. When I marked it out, I had already pulled it so that it's even and straight. So if it gets a little bit distorted in between marking and cutting like it just did, I know just to keep my cut on the line because I'll be able to get it back to where it was when I marked it out. So this piece has square edges on 1, 2, 3, 4 sides, and this is rounded over because that's the side that faces the back of the boat. So I want to keep some extra material there so I can round that over. And the rest of it is pretty much going to just be ending at the top edge. So I get them flattened out because it can be a little bit tedious, as you can see, before I even start mixing everything. So once I'm mixed, I don't have to waste any time doing this kind of work. Start in the middle because you can see there's some lumps here. I'm assuming you can see that. And work your way out. And the whole cloth will kind of grow a little bit because you're taking the high spots out. So as long as you have coverage before you start, which is what I have here, you'll easily be able to get around all your area. I have a little bit extra here, so I'm just going to pull it out a bit. Okay, that's a little bit better. I'm still covered on the front. I'm not wrapping that square edge. In fact, these side edges are beveled like this. So it's not even a straight edge that I can go around. It's a bevel that I'd have to go back. So it's gonna be even more difficult to get it to wrap. So it's just not gonna happen. Now when you do a piece like this one that has corners, you want to give it a slice. Think about it like wrapping a gift. So when I say give it a slice right at the corner, especially with the thicker cloth, here's my piece that I already cut. It's got to wrap around 4 sides with the contour of the wood. So it's plenty bigger than what I need. And I probably should have spent some more time getting it sized more appropriately, but quite frankly, I'm rushing this. It's late. I have a friend that requested that I make a video so that they can do some fiberglass work. And the only time I'm going to have to do this is tonight. So again, I'm working a little bit sloppier for the sake of getting it finished quicker. But anyway, so as you wrap the edges, this piece again being a 4-ounce, it might wrap, but I don't really want to take the chance. So I usually put a slice right down the middle. And again, because the fabric distorts as you move it around, I like to make cut marks so I can get my cuts in the right area in between getting it cut and then setting it up for the resin. So these are where the cuts are going to be, and I'll make them with the razor blade. And as I work the resin in, it's going to work out because I was able to, whoops, doing the wrong side of this one. Because I was able to mark it out at a point where I know where it will work, as opposed to not marking it out, just cutting corners and then ending up with a cut someplace where it's not so good, or just not so effective. All right, so this piece I'm going to lay, this is the back side. We're not wrapping any corners, so I'm going to lay these 3 pieces on there like that. This one I want to do my cut, so I'm just going to move it up like that. Make my cut, put it back. And I've never worked with this thinner stuff. I ordered it because it was cheaper and it will soak up less resin. Hope I didn't cut my table there. And it's just more efficient. I'm not looking for strength, I'm just looking for waterproofing. So I'm trying to get more specialized, just do a better job. So that's how I'm doing this. I won't have any problem getting this to wrap that corner with these cuts. It works on this 6 ounce, so this 4 ounce. I might not even need it, but I know I'll be good here. And once you wrap them, it all kind of bleeds together. You end up having to sand those corners because where you cut, you'll get some fibers sticking up out of the resin. Okay, so you're probably going to wonder what I'm doing with this. This is part of my friend's request. They're going to do a painting, not this one, but a different one, and they're thinking about using fiberglass on top of painter's canvas, which will cover various kinds of paint. So this is an unknown paint. This was just an experiment doing a color wheel. This is oil paint, this is acrylic. I'm going to take some of my waste and just cover this as an experiment. So if you notice me doing that, that's what that's all about. It really has nothing to do with the purposes that I set out for tonight of getting these wooden pieces covered. Okay, so it just makes sense. Do your big pieces first. Obviously, you get your big mixes out of the way, and every time I end up with some leftover material, I'm going to go to the smaller pieces. So overall, we're going to do these 3 surfaces, let them set up approximately 20 minutes, and then they're completely cured. You could sand them at that point. If you can't make if it's so hard that, for instance, with a pick, you can break the surface, scratch the surface, but not not depress the surface. You're ready. It's done. You can go ahead and sand it, paint it, do whatever you want to it. I'm not painting these for my use. They're going to stay just raw fiberglass. At some point they might get painted, I don't know. So I'm going to do these 3 surfaces, I'm going to let them set up, and then I'm going to do the opposite surfaces that aren't already done. I don't see any point in videotaping that. So I'm going to get these done, then I'd be turning them over, mixing up new batches till I'm finished. So let's start with a mixing container. So this is like a Tupperware, not a Tupperware, but a Tupperware style container you would get if you bought some frozen food. And I save them. So this kind of a plastic, whatever they make it out of, in most plastics, these slick kind of plastics, the resin doesn't stick to it. So you can mix it in here, and then when your leftover sets up, you can just flex it, it'll pop right out. But it does stick really well to wood, I think any kind of metal, and many other surfaces. You won't be able to get it off without sanding it off. So we're going to use this mixing container. So I read the directions, and it tells you how much to mix per ounce. And then it tells you to take the hardener and put so many drops per ounce. So what I did was I took some water. I figured out I wanted to use about 9 ounces of resin. I put the water in here, measured with a measuring cup, and then marked it off. So now I know where 9 ounces is on my container. Then I found out, I took a teaspoon. This is a 1/4 teaspoon, and I counted how many drops it took to fill this up. And the way it works out is for 9 ounces of resin, if I use, I wrote it on here, I wrote it on the other one. I like to make write on there what I'm doing so that when I forget, like I just did, I can go back to here. So I wrote on there hardener 1/4 teaspoon per 3 ounces. So when I make 9 ounces, I'll fill this up 3 times. So I've worked with professional glassers on other projects, and I've watched them do it. Again, that doesn't make me any kind of an expert. I just learned that these guys who really have a handle on how much hardener to use, they also put decelerants in it, accelerants, depending on temperature. I worked with a person who produced really nice results for fiberglass decks, and he would measure the outside temperature. I'm not sure if he measured humidity, I don't think it matters, and then he had data that he accumulated over the years where he knew how to set up his resin mix so that he would get enough work time. And even he didn't always get it right. Sometimes it set up too quick for them to work. Sometimes it set up pretty slowly to the extent where they did their work and it still wasn't set. But that's way beyond my knowledge level. So I'm going with the directions from the manufacturer on the container, and I'm sticking with what worked over the winter. So because I'm getting a set at 20 minutes, if you put too little hardener in, it may not set up ever for all I know, or it may just take a day. I gotta have this done tonight. I'm gonna use these wooden parts tomorrow. So I'm gonna stick with the directions that worked over the winter, but I'm gonna err on the side of less hardener. I'm quite sure even if I was a few drops shy, it would work out. Now here's the other thing. When you mix a lot of material, it builds up heat like an epoxy glue would. So you mix your material. If there's a lot of material in here, it's building up heat and making the whole batch cure quicker. That's something else to keep in mind. So if you're mixing 9 ounces and you're kind of comfortable with the way that reacts, and then you decide, okay, I need to use double that batch for the size of work I'm doing, keep in mind it's not going to be the same cure time. It's going to cure quicker. Unless you can get the whole thing dumped on your work so that it's not a larger quantity heating itself up more because there's so much there, so much material producing heat. So that's something to think about. Now here's a minor issue, but it's kind of important. This container has a recess in the bottom for whatever reason. You got to make sure that you dig the resin out of that recess to mix with your hardener. If you just mix it like this, you end up with a gooey section on the bottom that may never set up if the hardener doesn't get to it. So ideally you want to use a container that's uniform, flat, and doesn't have any recesses in it at all. I don't have one of those, and I know where these recesses are. I've worked with it many times. So I'm just going to be extra careful and make sure I get it all mixed up. The other thing is, once your hardener is completely mixed into the resin, you don't need to mix it anymore. You're just prolonging your work, you're shortening your work time by using up that time mixing. Plus, if you ingrain some air into it, you're going to get some air bubbles, and that's going to show up in the finished product. It's going to rise to the top, cause a pucker mark. You might get some air trapped in the resin. You don't want that. So you want to mix it about this fast. And you want to if you have recesses in your container, you want to try and work them out of the container so that the resin gets mixed in there. So let's get started on that. I'm going to pour it out right on the work. I think I'll give a close-up of this one piece because that's essentially what we're going to be doing. Obviously you want to wear gloves, because this resin is very difficult to get off of anything you get it on other than these slick kind of plastic containers, which it doesn't bond to. Okay, so I've got everything ready. I'm going to put 9 ounces in there and get started. Okay. Now you're going to watch that I'm going to work fast. And because if I do a finish on this boat part, I'm probably going to use like a spray-on bed liner. So it's not so important that it's nice and uniform. And because I'm kind of a form follows function guy when it comes to the boats, I'm not looking for a showpiece, I'm looking for like a lowest maintenance possible functional boat. I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting it super smooth here. I'm going to pour it on, work it to the edges with a brush. I use these things called chip brushes because I don't know how you could ever clean a brush with this resin on. I don't think you can. So these are like $1 each. You buy them by a 10-pack and then use them once and toss them. Once this hardener gets on here, you're not getting it off. If you probably could clean it. I think acetone works on the uncured hardener, uncured resin mixed with hardener. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. Let's see how good it goes. 9 ounces in. Now this stuff looks brown, but when it goes on thinner and then combines with the white cloth, it's just, we'll actually be able to see the wood. We'll give it kind of a yellow tone, almost like older polyurethane on a hardwood floor. Now something else just to know, once I pour that in there, I mean, I've got like a day's worth or more. That's fine just to have that. The critical clock starts ticking when you add the hardener. So if I, have to go do something, if I forget something, you could just leave that. It's not going to react without the hardener. So I take my hardener, I'm going to put 3 full teaspoons, err on the side of less, and I'm going to dump it in. Oh, that's a brand new tube and I didn't open it yet. Huh. Didn't realize that. So, case in point, I've got that open. It's not really, it's going to be okay. Don't want to make a big hole because I don't want this stuff blowing all out when I start using it. And then on smaller batches I might just be counting drops. But when you get your own stuff and you read the directions, if you're going to mix 9 ounces, it's something like, it's a lot of drops. So it's just not, it's a pain in the ass, put it that way. So I'm going to fill this up. I just ended up with an extra drop in there by accident. It's not going to really matter. Whoops. Bunch on there. You're going to see that spot get hard. Just squirted some hardener on here by accident. As soon as I put the resin on there, it's going to get hard quicker than everything else. So here's 2, and here's 3. Again, a little. If I was working in the winter, I would probably make sure that that's full across the top. And before I start with this, I'm going to try and soak up some of that resin because it's not going to help us. Some of the hardener that I got on this piece. I don't know if it's going to, it's probably soaking in the wood, but it's such a small spot, I'm not concerned really. Okay, so we're going to start mixing it. I'm going to get it mixed in there. And I can actually see, it looks like an oily swirl in the middle, like if you put some oil in water. So I kind of see where that hardener is getting to. I can see it disappearing now. So now I'm going to go along the edges and I'm going to scrape out that bottom recess using this paint mixing, what do you call these things, sticks at an angle. So I'm spatulaing the resin out of that bottom recess because we're essentially about distributed with that hardener. I can't see it in. I can see a little bit of traces on the top. So I'm going to mix this for about a minute, more or less. And I'm not timing it. I'm just kind of thinking it through. And when I feel like I've got a good uniform mix and I've gone around all the edges to get that resin off the edges so it can get mixed in with the hardener, think about it, 9 ounces of hardener to 3/4 of a teaspoon. There's a lot of hardener that has to get there's a lot of resin to distribute that hardener in. So you don't want to shortcut it, but you don't want to, be a slow poke and end up with resin that's gone off or it started to cure before you even get it on your work. So I'm getting it off the bottom. I'm going across that bottom panel that's flat. Make sure I get all that resin pulled up off of there. I'm going to go around the sides once more, and then we're going to pour it on. By the way, I was just kind of chuckling to myself about going off. When I was young, going off meant something very different. Okay, so we're mixed. I'm going to pour the whole thing on. I know it's going to take more, at least I think it is. And the way this is working, it's flattening this thing out for me. I don't even have to do anything. There's enough weight in that resin for it to kind of just push that fabric out. So I want to get this material out of here. I'm not going to go crazy because if you end up pulling 90% of that material out there, it makes it harder to get the leftover out. If you leave enough in there that has thickness, again, you can flex it out, it'll just break out of there. There's no benefit to having this with some extra material on it. I've been using this one probably for, I don't know, 10 batches. And I want to show you something quick because I don't have a lot of time. Oops, I'm plugging myself. Okay, so you can probably see some dark blotches there. And what that is the resin. You can in the middle. The resin it's almost like it's melting into the cloth. With that kind of soak, you won't even be able to see any cloth. It'll just look clear, and that's what we want. That's a really good what would you call it? Combination. Now we don't need it that thick, and I don't need to waste a lot of material. So I'm going to start moving this around. It's perfectly fluid right now. It doesn't get any more fluid than this. It's not setting up yet. It's probably about 72 degrees in here in the air conditioning. Now when I did that last piece, it would have been set up by now. And I'm not doing anything other than spreading the material. That's what I'm focused on doing here. Again, working from the middle and pushing it out towards the edges. I'll let you know when it starts to set up. So I'm already at the edge here. And again, I'm not folding this over. That's going to end up getting sanded off. And you could take a 50 grit sandpaper and it breaks that right out. And this is a hole I cut in there for a light base. And the thing about that is it's good to have some resin soak into any cuts you have, including holes that you might have for fasteners. This is already pre-drilled for my fasteners, but as that resin soaks into those holes, it's going to waterproof the hole. If you've ever seen rotten parts on a boat, they tend to rot. Marine plywood tends to rot wherever there's a penetration, because the sides of the penetration weren't sealed. So as moisture works into those sides and gets trapped between the fasteners and the material itself, it'll rot over time. So I like to have all my fasteners pre-drilled, pre-cut, whatever the case may be, and then work that resin right over it, and it tends to seal the hole. Sometimes for a project, I'll use a hole saw, for instance. I'll use a hole saw that's much bigger than I need. I'll fill that hole, maybe a 1/4 inch around that hole saw cut with fabric, cloth, and resin, and then I'll go back and cut the size I need. So there's like a 1/4 inch of fiberglass surrounding the entire hole. So even if it got flooded every day, it wouldn't matter. If that doesn't make sense, just think about it. Okay, so I'm about out of working time here now. And it's a little bit thicker in the middle than what I really need, but that's all right. So now what I want to do is not spread it anymore, but make sure my cloth gets soaked. So I'm going to try and essentially what I'm doing here is not moving it anymore into the cloth, but making sure that this cloth gets saturated, because that's what gives you a good bond. When you don't see the cloth fibers anymore, you have a good bond between the various materials. So these edges are done. I want to get underneath this, good thing I covered the table, and get this edge rolled where it's wet. So that's how I'm going to roll it. Again, this is the thinner material. You can see right here, I think you can see that. It doesn't want to stay down. I've got resin on there. I'm pushing it down with the brush. Can you see that? Yeah, you can. I'll give you a better angle. And it just keeps coming right back up. I got fiberglass on my floor. Somebody will have something to say about that. Okay. Now, you can see that this doesn't want to stay down. So just envision a thicker cloth. And as I push this down, it wants to come up here. So, for my purposes, if I end up with a lift, this piece of fabric, cloth, lifting because this section lifting because I'm pushing this down, it's not the end of the world. I'll sand it off. And I'm not talking about an hour's worth of sanding. I'm talking about taking a 50 grit belt sanding and running it across for about 30 seconds and flattening that out. And if I sand through the cloth, so what? If this area of cloth is compromised, yeah, I don't have strength, but keep in mind, I'm using the same thickness material, albeit not as strong of a wood, but close, and I'm adding fiberglass strength to it, so again, not critical for me. So I have to keep working this piece here until it starts to set up. That's the one thing that my method is not very efficient in, that I got to keep working this, because if I don't, I'll come back in 5 minutes, I'll be sticking straight up, and I don't get the effect that I want. Here, the resin kind of melts the cloth. When I say melt, it doesn't melt it, but it binds in there. It softens it for sure. So as the resin works on the cloth, it's making it more pliable. As the resin starts setting up, it's going to hold that cloth against the wood. And keep in mind, plywood, if you have voids on the edges, one thing about marine plywood is it has less voids in it. I guess also cabinet grade plywood would have less voids, maybe no voids. But this is construction grade plywood. It would be exterior grade. So you can leave it out in the weather and it won't fall apart. I know that from using it for other uses for many years.